Instead of lamenting about the state of education in much of Africa, Fred Swaniker started his own school 4 years ago. The African Leadership Academy is teaching students from across the continent.
Young people across Africa, there are about 400 million people in Africa below the age of 16 that have not necessarily been educated properly. And that's a ticking time bomb.
This week on African Voices, Fred Swaniker, a man who believes passionately in educating Africa's children to solve Africa's problems. Fred Swaniker opened the African Leadership Academy, or ALA, on the grounds of a former printing training college on the outskirts of Johannesburg. A prestigious boarding school with an education model that has its roots in the Ghanaian-born Swaniker's own life.
I left Ghana when I was 4 years old, and every 4 years of my life I moved to a new country in Africa. So I lived in the Gambia, I lived in Botswana, I lived in Zimbabwe. And then eventually after college I moved to South Africa. So what this did for me is it really got me to see myself not as a Ghanaian, but as an African. So when I look at ALA today, the lot of work that I'm doing is really aligned with this passion that I have for Africa. I really want to see this continent that I love so much succeed. Another aspect of my personal story is that when I was 18 years old, my dad had just passed away. And my mother had been a really good teacher in Botswana, where we were living at the time. And the parents approached her to start a school, but she had a full-time job as a teacher, so she couldn't run the school. So she put me in charge of the school as the headmaster. And I managed the school. I led the class, the teachers who were there. I collected the fees from the parents, etc.
You were the headmaster at 18?
Yes.
Had you gone to university yet?
No, I had a gap year to wait. I just finished my high school education. I was waiting for a year to go before I could go to university. And so during that year, I ran the school. And that experience that I had when I was 18 gave me the confidence and the practice to do what, when I was 27, was a much bigger project, which is the African Leadership Academy. And I firmly believe that a leadership experience that a young person gets, in their teens particularly, gives them the foundation to do something much bigger later on in their life. So even if it's a small project that they're doing, but it gives them the experience of hands-on leadership. Because I believe that you don't learn leadership through theory, you learn leadership by leading. And so that's what we're trying to replicate here at the Academy, is we get young people from all across the continent, bring them here initially for 2 years, give them this hands-on leadership practice. So they have to launch a business while they're here on the campus or launch a venture in the community. And through that practice, they get in these what look like small projects. They're getting the experience that will one day prepare them to do something much bigger for the continent.
So it doesn't matter if these projects don't work out.
Absolutely.
Or if the idea wasn't really good in the first
Absolutely
place. It's the fact that they're doing it.
It's the fact that they got practice. I mean, you should attend a board meeting of these 17-year-olds on campus when they formed a team, and there's a CEO, there's a CFO, and they're presenting to their board. I mean, it's very similar to what you would see in a real-life board meeting of a large-size corporation. And if you look at the history of a lot of great leaders who changed the world, you can trace it back to a formative experience that they had in leadership in their teens. So Richard Branson started selling magazines when he was 16. And that's what prepared him to one day build Virgin. Nelson Mandela got involved with the ANC Youth League when he was in his early 20s. And that prepared him to lead this tremendous change that occurred in South Africa. Michael Dell was selling computers in his dorm room when he was 19 years old, and that prepared him to build Dell. Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook as a 17-year-old when he was in his dorm room at Harvard University. That prepared him to start Facebook. And so we're trying to do the same thing for Africa. That's because somewhere out there on this continent is the next Nelson Mandela, is the African Bill Gates, is the African Steve Jobs. And our job, or our aim, is to find these young people, bring them here, and give them this formative, practical leadership experience, which will prepare them to change the continent.
How do you find them?
How do we find them? Well, we developed an elaborate system across the continent where we have about 2,500 educational institutions and NGOs that are working with youth throughout Africa in the most impoverished areas and in refugee camps, etc. So, for example, we collaborate with the UN High Commission for Refugees. Every year they send us a few hundred refugee applicants. And through this network, we find exceptional young people who have demonstrated that they have this leadership potential.
So it's not just the cleverest.
No, we're not looking.
It's not just this, you know, the person who stands up the tallest.
Absolutely not, because you see, the best leaders are not necessarily the smartest people. You know, we're looking for people who have demonstrated 4 attributes in particular. One is courage. Because the job of a leader is difficult, and very often creating change is going to be met with a lot of resistance, and you need to have courage to really step up and make that change. The second thing we're looking for are people who have passion. You know, people who won't give up until what they are dreaming about has happened. We're looking for perseverance. People who, when they meet one obstacle after another, they'll keep going and they'll find a way around it, and they really will last the journey. And then finally, we're looking for people who have good values. You know, because when you think about why a lot of Africa's leaders have gone, have not necessarily served our content well, it's when their values have gone off. And that's another reason why we're getting them this early age, because this is the age where they're just coming out from under the influence of their parents and starting to form their own views of the world. And if you can instill in them good values at this stage and build a solid foundation, then when they go on later on in their lives to become leaders, then we can really hope for good leaders in Africa, because it's almost impossible to change someone's values when they're in their 40s and 50s. You need to begin from the foundation stage. So over the last 4 years since we opened our doors here at the Academy, we've identified about 9,400 potential candidates from 48 countries across Africa. And we've selected 400 to be part of this program. And our aim is to create 6,000 leaders over a 50-year period for Africa.
Next up, how to choose Africa's next leaders.
Okay, let's go. Yeah. And go sideways. Yeah.
Being blindfolded and having to rely on others is one way Fred Swaniker's African Leadership Academy is teaching teenagers about leadership, about trust, about instinct.
I just want to go back to that issue of how you find a leader. Is it obvious? You meet a 16-year-old from somewhere in the north of Nigeria, or someone in the south of Sudan.
Yeah.
And do you meet them and you go, he's one of ours?
Sometimes. Sometimes you meet them and immediately you can tell that this person, has the attributes you're
Is it a
looking for.
twinkle in the eye? Is it something the way they hold themselves? I mean, I'm just curious in the sort of the anatomy of a leader, in a way, particularly that new leader who's just about to be born.
There's a question we ask every person who applies to the Academy. And the question we ask them is, tell us about a time you identified a need in your community. What did you do about it? And that's when you see very often we separate the talkers and the thinkers from the doers, right? So that's when we hear the stories about how there was no school in my refugee camp, so I built the school. Or I was infected with HIV as a teenager, and so I started my own NGO to bring about awareness around this disease and built a school for others who were infected with HIV like myself when I was 18 years old. So you have, or that's when you hear the story about there was no electricity in my village, so I built a windmill and created electricity to power my house and several others in the community. And young people doing this without any support through their own initiative. And that's what we use as the first screen to say, okay, when these people see a problem in their community, they don't just sit back and hope that someone else will solve it. They actually step up and they make change. And so that's what we're looking for. But it's also important to note that not everyone that we bring here has demonstrated this, has built a windmill, or, because we believe that leaders are made and not born. So there would be no reason for ALA, for African Leadership Academy to exist if we didn't believe that we could actually create leaders. And so we believe that we've actually got a model or a process that enables us to develop leaders in a systematic way. Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, people always want to bet on something that's winning, right? People always want to bet on the winning horse. And it's a shame, right? Because very often you start a project, it's a great concept, but no one wants to take the risk So you just have to keep going and achieve little wins here and there, and then eventually others will jump on the wagon once it's going. So that's the thing you have to always keep going after. It's just don't give up until you get that first person to believe in you.
Swaniker says he's created a curriculum, a working model to instill good leadership on the continent.
At the heart of what we're doing really is a belief that the main reason why Africa has not met its full potential today is due to the quality of the leaders that we have. And so this is really an attempt to solve that issue. So, you know, and so that's the whole impetus for the African Leadership Academy is really saying, let's address, instead of trying to deal with all the symptoms of bad leadership that we have in Africa, you know.
And there's a long list of that.
There's a long list of that, and that's where most of efforts in Africa have been going towards. You know, there's a refugee crisis, and so we're sending blankets for the refugees that have been caused by the war. But let's look back and say, how do we create leaders that don't go to war in the first place? You know, that talk to themselves and find peaceful ways of addressing issues. You know, there's a famine, so we send food aid. That feeds people for three months. Then they're hungry again. That will not stop until we create an amazing African scientific leaders who will come up with innovations that will allow us to feed ourselves, and politicians who will create the policies that will allow us to improve our crop yields. And those types of leaders, that when we look at the root cause of underdevelopment in Africa, that really is you know, we trace it all back to leadership.
You say you want 6,000 leaders to come out of these walls, essentially. Yeah. Is that enough? Can you actually make a difference with 6,000?
I believe absolutely. One of our key beliefs here at African Leadership Academy is in the power of one. Because we believe that behind every change in society, there's normally one or two people who catalyze that change. We believe that leaders are agents of positive change, and you can lead in any sphere. So, you know, we're not trying to create political leaders here only, or business leaders only. We're trying to create leaders in all segments of society. So leaders in science and technology, leaders in business, entrepreneurs who can create the millions of jobs that we need on the continent, political leaders who can create the policies that we need to develop properly, leaders in the non-profit sector who will build innovative non-profit ventures that will bring clean drinking water and education to people in the rural areas. You know, we really need leaders from all walks of life to solve the various challenges that we have in Africa.
We talk a lot about leadership. You talk about mentoring, we talk about entrepreneurship. But when it boils down to it, it's all about education, isn't it? And often when I travel across Africa, that is, for me, the most crucial issue. The roads, absolutely, power, yes, but educating Africa's children is so fundamental. And that's where there have been some of the biggest failures.
Yes, I mean, education is critical to the long-term success of Africa. It's one of the most important things we need to address if we're going to stand on our own feet. It's important because unless we are educated, we won't know how to build our own roads and create our own, you know, innovative products out of the amazing resources that we have on the continent, and solve these challenges around healthcare, etc. So, absolutely, we need to address the education problem, and do that on a massive scale. Because with that, then we can take care of ourselves as Africans.
And the foundations of change are built with a simple combination of factors, says Swaniker.
I don't believe that education is about buildings. It's about three things. It's about great people, great teachers, great students, and a great curriculum. And if you get those three things right, you can put that under a tree, and you'll get a great institution, great education. And so we hope to share the methods that we are applying here at the Academy with schools throughout Africa. And in doing so, hopefully we can help them to, you know, uplift their standards as well. But I keep going back to this, you know, how we solve the education problem in Africa. It's not necessarily by investing in bricks and mortar and building fancy classrooms, but it's really about getting the right teachers into classrooms and improving the curriculum that we have. And if we get those two things right with the students that we have, we can really change, the education systems in a very exceptional manner.
Up next, which countries in Africa Swaniker believes have the best and worst education?
I mean, countries that are really struggling as well.
When you look across the whole map of Africa, you get thousands of applications every year. What for you are the countries that have the strongest education system?
Well, certain countries stand out for us every year in the applicant pool. Kenya, across the board, not just in math and science, but really in all spheres, they've got an excellent education system. Zimbabwe as well. At the national level, even though we've had the leadership there is really terrible, in the community level and in schools, they've still got exceptional leadership, the principals and the discipline of the teachers, etc. So that comes through in the results that they have.
And that's not just in the urban areas, it's in the rural areas.
rural
I've
areas,
seen it,
everything,
you've
yeah,
seen it.
exactly.
It's absolutely true. Where else on the continent? We're talking Kenya, Zimbabwe, good education.
Nigeria, actually, also.
Across the whole of Nigeria or
well,
just parts of it?
Well, I don't know if it's simply because we get so many applications from Nigeria. We get 700 applications from Nigeria. But we find that they're quite good in math and science. They're quite good in math and science in Nigeria. And Senegal is also exceptional education system, even in the rural areas, and Cote d'Ivoire as well.
Has an excellent education system.
Yeah, I mean countries that are really struggling as well as Liberia. We find that students from there are quite weak and underprepared, and actually South Africa.
Swaniker is one of the few people who can give a Pan-African assessment of education in Africa.
We are fortunate enough to see the quality of education systems across the entire continent, because we get applicants every year. This past year we got 3,000 applications from 48 countries in Africa for 100 places here at the academy. And so we see the caliber of the applicants, and we can therefore infer the caliber of the education systems through these countries. And without fail, the Kenyans come out very strong. The Senegalese are very strong in math and science. The Nigerians are very strong in math and science as well. And Zimbabwe, yes, as you mentioned, we always find exceptionally talented young people coming from there, or exceptionally prepared young people. In South Africa, we find when we bring the South African students here, they struggle to keep up with their peers from the rest of Africa, especially in math and science. And this is a country that is blessed with so many more resources than these other countries are. I think, so that boils down to two things, as I mentioned. One is the quality of the teachers. So I think even in poor countries, they've done a good job of building a good caliber of teachers. But and when I talk about quality of teachers, I'm not only talking about just how well trained they are, but also their work ethic and how well led they are by the principals of those schools. Because that, I think, is actually probably a greater factor than just how well trained they are. The other aspect that I believe is contributing to success in some countries like Zimbabwe is probably the social fabric. Because educational achievement is also a function of the home environment and parental influence and how supportive communities and families are of the young people that are in school. And I think because of the history of this country and how fragmented society became because of apartheid.
And how the nuclear family
was broken up in South Africa. You don't have that supportive system that can help these young people learn. And when you go home from school and your parents are not there, or they're drunk, or one of them or they passed away because of HIV/AIDS, it's difficult as a young person to rise above all that and make it on your own. In other countries in Africa, this social fabric is still there. And so that is another contributing factor that I believe is allowing these countries to survive, to have better education despite the lack of resources.
The bad parenting, and it's again, we talk about bad teachers, we talk about bad parenting, but it is. I mean, a South African mother is often single.
Yes.
Doesn't have a husband to support her.
Yes.
Or a partner.
Is working long hours.
Is working long hours. And the children are not getting that very important, what is it?
It's two things. It's the setting of expectations and saying, I believe in you as a young person. You can do well, you can study, you can succeed. And then it's backing those expectations with support, where you actually sit down with them, help them with their homework, and encourage them when they're finding things difficult that they can do it. And that's what is missing when societies break up. And I think that but this also goes back to leadership, because every parent in a household should see themselves as a leader. You are leading what is happening in that household. You're leading what is happening to your children. And if we could get every parent in South Africa thinking of themselves as a leader and really showing leadership in their homes, or grandmothers or whatever, taking that leadership role and saying, I am going to make sure that the young people in my family are well educated, or take education seriously, you can also start to see that turnaround.
From the home to the classroom, mentoring and teaching, Swaniker's vision is fundamentally optimistic about the future.
When you think about African Leadership Academy, I don't see this as a school. I see it as a network of leaders that we're creating to address the greatest challenges that Africa faces. And so we want to support this network.
It's like an army of warriors.
Oh, exactly, who will change Africa, you know. And so we want to work with them here in this 2-year program, when they're in college, when they graduate from college, when they're young professionals, and when they're later in their lives. And so 50 years from now, we'll look back and we'll have this network of 6,000 leaders that we've created. And some of them are in their 60s and 70s, and they'll just be retiring as chief justice and presidents of countries and CEOs and amazing nonprofit leaders. And they'll be nurturing and mentoring the 21-year-olds in the network who would have just left this 2-year program and are just in university. And they'll be giving each other opportunities and collaborating on projects, and they'll know each other. Can you imagine if you have people all across Africa that trust each other, that have personal relationships? When there's a conflict between one country and another, they're not going to go to war because they'll just call each other and they'll have a relationship. You know, we'll be able to facilitate trade between countries because of those personal relationships that happen. Right now, we only do 12% of our trade with each other as African countries. I mean, that's shocking. How are we going to develop ourselves without this Pan-African integration? We talk about the 2 trillion GDP that we have in Africa, or the billion people that we have on the continent. None of that is realizable unless we bring the continent together. And it's these leaders that we're developing here who are living together with their peers from all across the continent that are going to be best equipped to do that.
Are you a bit of a revolutionary? Are you fomenting revolutions in decades to come, long after you're gone?
Well, hopefully it'll be a positive revolution, yes. A revolution that we'll all be proud of, because ultimately its aim is to create a better life for all of us on the continent.